Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think we've been blown away by the different countries and regions that people are joining us from today. I think from as far-flung as Pakistan, South Korea, all the way across the world, here in East Africa, United Kingdom, Germany, the United States. It's a truly global panel, which is only fitting for a very distinguished group of international travelers, tourism and wildlife conservationists, journalists, that I have the great honor to be on this panel with, which is a great pleasure. My name is Constantin Bjerke. I'm a board member at the International Fund for Animal Welfare. And in my other sort of day job, I am a media entrepreneur and producer, currently here in East Africa, having just climbed Kilimanjaro 2 weeks ago, and producing a small wildlife documentary in some of the parks that IFAW is also active in. As our co-hosts Asilia, who have some of the most glorious camps that one could possibly imagine in this part of the world. It's a very fitting time for us, I think, to come together and have this conversation and this panel discussion, as in Europe, Israel, the United States, vaccines are rolling out. In Tanzania, the president was just pronounced dead. Still nobody quite knows what, but officially in Tanzania, there is no coronavirus, but clearly it also exists here. And coronavirus has, I think, been the predominant theme and topic for all of us over the last year. And whilst, obviously in Europe and America and many other parts of the world, lockdowns have been somewhat buffered in many cases by government interventions. The same cannot be said about East Africa, where tourism in Kenya has declined by 98% last year. And obviously the absence of that fundamental revenue stream has led to enormous suffering for the populations here, which impacts not just Asilia, that is both in the tourism and in the conservation business, but obviously also organizations like IFAW who try to protect landscapes and wildlife and build communities. Bushmeat poaching has gone up by 56% last year. So there have really been some dire consequences, but there is hope on the horizon in form of vaccines, and with some of the lockdowns eased in parts in December and in February, there have been a few more arrivals to this part of the world. But this is what we want to talk about today, is the future of conservation tourism. And it's a great pleasure to welcome to the panel Andrea Sachs, who is the travel writer for the Washington Post for well over 20 years. She's received numerous awards and prizes for her work, and as obviously knows this part of the world like the back of her hand, but is also able to give us insights from more far-flung places, after having spent some time in a yurt with reindeer herders in Mongolia, I've been told. Then with us is Katie, who works for Asilia, and as you can see in the background, is currently at one of their fabulous camps, apparently with 2 cheetahs running around in camp at the moment. Then we have James Isiche, who is IFAW's East Africa director, formerly worked for Kenya Wildlife Service. So James is very uniquely placed to give us the perspective on the impact of the absence of travel on wildlife crime and wildlife populations here. And last but not least, George Benjamin, a fabulous wildlife photographer from England, with his work published in Discovery and National Geographic and the BBC and many other fabulous accomplishments under his belt. And like me, he's also traveled around the area during coronavirus, so he'll be able to share with you that unique perspective of what it is like to experience Africa as it was 60 years ago when it's empty, which is an individual privilege, but a communal, regional tragedy. Couple of household items. I've been asked to tell you this is a recorded session, so we can also share it with everybody afterwards. And if you have any questions for the panelists, we're going to leave a fair amount of time at the end. There's a Q&A button in your Zoom screen somewhere, and we'd ask you to just click on that and type your questions in there, and we'll come to them towards the end of the panel. With no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Katie. Welcome to the panel, and maybe you can tell us a little bit, some introductory remarks from your end.
Thanks so much, Constantin. Welcome everybody to the Masai Mara Nabosho Conservancy in Kenya, where I'm very lucky to be today. Keep an eye out for a giraffe or two behind me, and there are a couple of cheetah kicking around. So if they come too close, please let me know. For those of you that don't know us, Asilia Africa is an East Africa safari operator. We have 21 small safari camps across Kenya and Tanzania and Zanzibar, and we're leaders in conservation tourism. Our whole company was founded on the belief that tourism can be used as a force to do good, not just for wildlife and ecosystems, but also the local communities. And so that runs through everything we do, and we work very hard to support both of those sides because they both need and supporting to thrive. Conservation levy, which we added into our accommodation rates to make sure that all of our guests staying with us were contributing to that positive impact just by coming and staying with us on safari. As Constantin said, the last year during the COVID pandemic has been absolutely devastating for the tourism industry worldwide. And the impact has been wide-ranging for the whole supply chain, down to the farmer producing milk for morning coffee here in camp, to the question of how rangers who are protecting the national parks will get paid. Early on in the pandemic, Asilia decided it was critical to keep a circuit of safari camps open, while many others closed their doors for months. Despite the cost and risk to us, we felt it was really super important to do this, to keep our commitments to the national parks and wild places and areas that rely on us to survive, keep vehicles moving around places like the Masai Mara to deter grazing and poaching, and to support our employees and those guests who were able to travel along the way. We led the way in creating COVID protocols from that early stage, and we're now very well practiced at those. And the priority was to create a really safe environment, not just for our guests, but also our staff and the local communities. Whilst it's been a really challenging year, and I'm sure there are more challenges ahead of us, there are plenty of reasons for hope and optimism for the future. When we speak to guests, whether they're in camp right now or guests coming in the future, they all say that safari ticks a lot of boxes of what travelers are looking for after a year of not traveling anywhere. They're looking for somewhere safe with proper COVID protocols, out in the open air as much as possible, spending time in nature after months in lockdown in their homes. And many are looking for a really meaningful experience, something extraordinary that really makes some memories, and also something really sustainable and leaving a positive impact. I think people have become much more aware of that in the last year, whether it's supporting small local businesses and how we spend our time and money and our priorities. And that positive impact runs through everything we do here at Asilia, from hiring and training our staff to empowering women, to the activities that we offer our guests, to choosing to operate camps in remote locations that really need tourism dollars to help them thrive, like Rabondo Island in Lake Victoria. We've also seen a real uptake in people looking for an adventure, and obviously coming on safari is a huge adventure for most people, and I couldn't agree more. But we also have something for people who want something more active and more immersive, our collection of Fasciliar Adventures, where you can spend full days with the Hadzabe or Maasai people, or a 5-day walking safari traverse from this very spot in Nabosho across the Masai Mara Conservancies. An amazing walking safari experience, but also visiting community and conservation projects along the way and really understanding how this whole ecosystem and balancing people and wildlife really works. We've been so grateful to those who've been able to travel and willing to throughout this crisis, and hope as restrictions lift, we can share this magic with more of you and help protect these wild places. So without further ado, I will hand over to James, the Regional East Africa Director of IFAW.
I think we'll just quickly move on to George, because I think James, like you, is in the, oh no, he's just come back. Sorry, because we just lost him. Sometimes in the bush, the connections are not ideal. James, are you back with us?
Yes, I'm here, Constantin. How are you?
Fantastic, very well. Karibu. The floor is yours.
Asante sana, and I apologize for the hitches that I've had. My name is James Isiche, as you've heard. I'm the Regional Director for IFAW, based in East Africa. The key project that we have at the moment is to secure space, and I'm happy that Katie has talked about working with the community, because the community here is key. The protected areas that we have, whether they are forests or national parks or reserves, marine parks or reserves, are not adequate in ensuring that the wildlife have all the needs that they require. So, for instance, here in Kenya, the wildlife estate, half of it is in community lands, and therefore it's very, very important that we work with communities. So what we are trying to do in IFAW is to ensure that there is connectivity between protected areas as much as possible through working with community groups. I will specifically mention Amboseli, Tsavo, Kilimanjaro landscape, which is a transborder landscape that transcends from the Kenyan border to Tanzania. And we are working with the community that is right at the border between Kenya and Tanzania to ensure that there is connectivity between Amboseli and Kilimanjaro National Park and further, because this is what wildlife needs and this is what wildlife has been doing. Unfortunately, because of many issues, including habitat fragmentation, land use changes, the fact that Africa is developing and infrastructure is being developed sometimes in the wrong places, you find that these routes that have been used by wildlife over centuries are being jeopardized. So we are trying to secure those routes to ensure that there is continuous movement, because wildlife cannot survive in parks and reserves alone. It requires more land than that. And this is a time and place to ensure that we are securing those areas. So among other things, we have worked with the community in Amboseli. Specifically, there's a group called OOGR. It's a long name and I will not tire you with trying to remember that name, but we have worked with them, 2,600 households, to ensure that we are securing 26,000 acres of land that allows wildlife to move across the border. If we did not do that, that land would have been turned into farmland, which is not compatible with wildlife conservation. And we have put in infrastructure to develop this land into a conservancy so that ecotourism activities can thrive there and the community can earn directly from ecotourism proceeds. Of course, given the challenges that we have now with COVID, it looks like ecotourism is not a thing to do, but I'm sure Katie will tell you that these ecotourism, there's still hope, there's still opportunities, and now that we have a vaccine, that movement is already beginning to happen. And most of the land, as I said, 50% of the land and the wildlife estate is in community areas, and we cannot afford to lose that land, because if we do, then wildlife is in danger. Thank you, Constantin.
Thank you very much, James. That was very insightful, and I can already see some questions coming in for you, which we'll deal with in a moment around the Kimana corridor. George, hi, welcome to the panel. Can you tell us a little bit about your travels last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think same as you, Constantine, it's a very unique position to be in. I actually traveled the end of last June as soon as I was legally able to in the UK, and traveled to Tanzania. And I mean, I've got quite a unique perspective in that I'm a wildlife photographer and I do work for Asilia, but I've also done work for plenty of conservation organizations, including IFAW. So with my foot in the photographer's realm for a second, it was quite unique and pretty amazing to be the only car at wildebeest crossings in the Serengeti, but simultaneously incredibly sad not to see a single car for days upon days upon days. And then when you're speaking with local people and local staff, you realize just how cataclysmic COVID-19 has been to both the ecotourism and conservation sectors, which, I mean, for the reasons of this webinar, they're so incredibly intertwined. And a question I've actually been asked a lot lately, because I also run photographic safaris, is do I think wildlife viewing as like the primary economic driver in East Africa and beyond is still viable? It's a very interesting one, because it absolutely still is, completely, because you can't beat a safari, let's be real for a second, but actually it's becoming part of a much wider spectrum. And you've all probably seen in the last year or so that the news and social media has just been awash with stories of the conservation structure really struggling, and as a result, the people, local communities, and wildlife ultimately suffering as well. And what I've been seeing with my clients from the past is that there's been a pretty incredible shift actually in the motivations for travel, or at least the motivations for future travel, with conservation now being at the forefront of many people's travel needs and wants. So for example, I quite often go to Naboisho Conservancy in Kenya, which is an amazing place over the last few years on plenty of photographic safaris. And in all honesty, the primary objective is always to improve the photographs of my guests. And the way they support conservation is through conservancy fees and park fees, which is great. And they're very happy to know it, but it's not at the forefront of their minds. And it's almost, that's kind of flip reverse now. So I'm getting repeat guests coming to me asking for trips with a very heavy conservation slant, which is amazing. So what they're wanting to learn more about is conservation photography. So they're actually wanting to not just go and see all the animals you're seeing on the slideshow here. They're actually wanting to go to the projects themselves, whether it's the Mara Raptor project or collaring elephants, or doing more community-based projects like the amazing Mara Bee Trust. I'm actually wearing one of their bracelets now, in the Boy Show, trying to understand how the whole circle connects up. And more so how they can use their own photography for conservation, which is pretty amazing as well. So it's now it's shifted from just trying to impress their friends, but actually trying to enable their friends to spread the positive word around conservation and to encourage people ultimately to go to East Africa. And then what's quite interesting here is that often conservation trips are kind of aligned with, like, you know, the gap year volunteering kind of trips that people often do in Zanzibar with dolphins or counting lions in the Boy Show. And actually, I think that's going to change. I think it's going to change quite quickly as well, just on the basis of the amount of messages I'm receiving from people and the similar questions I'm being asked by people within the industry. So I feel like now we're at the end of March, and I think with the vaccines, as you said, we are on the brink of travel becoming possible again and easier for a lot of people as well with the vaccinations. So it's a really exciting time. And I'm very interested to see how the needle is going to keep moving over the next year or so.
Yeah, thank you, George. Those are both some striking images, and I already see in the Q&A somebody thanking you for the Prince for Wildlife fundraisers. Apparently, your photographs also raise lots of money for conservation, which is fabulous. With that, I'd love to move on to Andrea, who's our little crystal ball, so to speak, and she's going to hopefully give us some insight when she unmutes herself into the future of travel. Andrea.
Thank you so much. Hello from Washington, D.C. So I'm the travel writer at the Washington Post, and of all the sections I got hit the hardest, ours, I have to say. Politics did really well, health science did really well. We had to get rid of all of our destination feature stories and focus on first refunds, then how to bide your time when you're stuck at home. And now finally, we're seeing a little bit of hope and travel is resuming. In the beginning, it was really about getting your test beforehand. And now I see a shift toward if you have your vaccine. So I've heard news from Greece will probably be reopening soon. I think that Iceland, Georgia's been open, and they just want proof of the vaccination, obviously with the 3 big ones is a requirement. So that is really hopeful. The cruise industry is trickling. They're talking about May and June. It's already started in Singapore, more domestic. So if you're in England, you can travel with an English company. So we're seeing a lot of that. I know Canada has been closed. I don't mean to do a laundry list. Canada has been closed, which is affecting the Alaskan cruise industry. So some companies are getting really creative, and one company is doing catamaran during the day, and then at night you sleep on the ship at port. So that's one way to get around Canada. So what we're seeing also with the vaccinations, it's the first group out of the gate would be seniors. So they are out and running. A lot of hotels and resorts are seeing senior rates being embraced, but also younger people in their late teens, well, legal age to travel, 18, early 20s to 30s. And what they're wanting is not to party, but they want wildlife, they want sun, they want nature. And that I see as a trend that has been growing over the year, where the one solace we have is to go outdoors and be safe. And I'm hoping that that sticks, that more people embrace their state and national parks, that they do not just the big ones, but the small fries, that we are more ethical with our wildlife conservation. We stay away from wet markets. I think people are more aware of the hazards that animals are going through. I hope there's a fall. A lot of it is a hopeless, but I do feel this is going to happen. A fall in over tourism and a rise in civility. So those are some of the things. I can keep on
Thank
talking.
you. Thank you very much, Andrea. Those are very, very interesting insights. And actually what you were saying, I mean, I guess it's only been probably a week or two that the sort of vaccine passport that was, I think, first dismissed as creating sort of two-class society, at least in Europe. Now the EU Commission president has brought it up because I think that the southern European countries, depending on tourism, require tourism. But Africa, where we are here, is obviously a very, very long time away from getting any kind of vaccines, which obviously, well, we have the classic north-south divide. What's your view, Andrea, on travel back here to Africa, in terms of, I suppose, reliability, safety, but then also ultimately to nurture the local economies and communities here? And I'm seeing some questions in the Q&A already on that. You know, is it safe to come to Africa? Which countries can you go to? So maybe you can give us your views on that as well.
Well, I think I found State Department has done a phenomenal job of taking each country and giving a little overview of what the vaccination policies are, if they do have vaccines available to locals, what the restrictions are, at least for Americans. And I know each country has a different State Department, and they've been very helpful over this year with COVID information. My sense right now would be that people will go toward tour operators that are helping them understand the bureaucracy, the restrictions, and just to stay safe. So I think independent travel is going to, some people will still do it, but I think a lot of people just stepping out of the gate, they just want to know that they're with, say, you know, a safari camp or somebody who is upholding the standards and can help them maneuver through if they have to get a COVID test to return to their country and things of that sort. So I see it happening, but cautiously. I don't think we're going to just see everyone flooding. And I think that's a wise thing, is to just have a tempered return. As for which countries, I don't know. I would have to. Kenya. I think the big ones, obviously, but some are, and I don't know if people will be turned off by this, that the countries are deniers. You know, they're not really fully embracing the idea of a vaccination. And so I think a lot of people will be worried about going to a country right now because it's all so new. Maybe when we get herd immunity, they'll feel more confident that they can go into these environments.
Yeah. Yeah. Katie, I see a question here, and actually probably for Andrea and Katie, I see a question here asking about certification of suppliers that offer sustainable and conservational, I guess, services and products. So trips, camps, lodges. Is there anything beyond, I suppose, TripAdvisor and the scrutiny of the public? And I've already been asked why I had a plastic bottle here. So the scrutiny of the public is tireless and vigorous. Is there anything sort of more institutionalized that certifies travel to, should we say, good operators, places, lodges, safari operators, and so on?
Yeah, thanks, Constantin. There are a lot of certifications. There's Responsible Travel, Responsible Tourism Tanzania, Fair Trade Kenya, lots and lots of sort of small and large organizations that do those certifications, certainly in Africa. And some of them you have to jump through an awful lot of hoops, and there's different levels and standards and things. Asilia, because we put a lot of emphasis as a business on it, we do work hard to keep those certifications up, because we understand that everybody talks about trying to do good, and it's very hard as a traveler sitting at home to understand what that really means. So an independent certification makes a big difference. We are also certified by a company called GIIRS, and we're the first safari operator in Africa to get platinum level. And they make us work very hard to keep that platinum level every year. So it's a bit like a financial audit, but for conservation and sustainability and all of our practices in our camps, in our offices, etc. So I would say do a bit of research. The ones that are working hard at it are listing that kind of information on their website, or can answer if you ask them directly.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, it really is incumbent on the traveler to call these people, email, and ask questions. And if they can't answer, then I would be suspicious a little bit. Like, they should be touting them. They should be like, these are our cleaning policies. This is social distancing. Our staff is tested. They have the vaccination. They need to, that's boast. Like, you be proud of that. But if they're cagey about it, I would not feel comfortable going there. So, but as I said, it's like, it's our job as a traveler, our job to just ask those questions and just be annoying until you get the answers. And if not, you just move on.
Yeah, and I think actually the public is also very good at this. I think, you know, a lot of people that travel to Africa, that go on safari, you know, care about the treatment of animals, of staff. So you, like Katie says, you know, there are some certifications, but really the reviews are going to give you a lot of insight, and frankly, like, you know, like Andrea says, I mean, send an email, ask the questions, whether it's on COVID protocol or on how they, you know, where their water comes from, how they do their waste management, you know, whether they buy locally, and so on and so forth. James, can you maybe give us some of the statistics that I saw coming out of Kenya, particularly last year, have been absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, 98% drop in tourist arrivals, 56% rise in bushmeat poaching. What can be done about that? I've also seen a question here. Somebody asking, you know, if we don't feel comfortable to come to Africa at the moment, what can we do? So James, what's already being done on the ground, and what can people who are not on the ground do to help?
Well, I'll try to remember all your questions, Constantin, but indeed, when COVID broke out, the revenue, of course, tourism stopped because the skies were locked. There were no incoming flights, international flights. And a lot of our tourism revenue comes from actually international tourism as opposed to domestic tourism. So at the beginning of COVID-19, I can give, for instance, Kenya Wildlife Service lost over 98% of its revenue because of, tourism just stopped. Not only was the international flights not coming in, but there was a lockdown. So even within the country, people could not travel. And therefore the parks suffered heavily. The parks rely in Kenya and most of East Africa actually, they rely on tourism revenue, not government subventions. The governments come in just, when there's dire needs. Otherwise, they are semi-government authorities that are supposed to generate their own revenue through tourism. So what happened in Kenya, for instance, with Kenya Wildlife Service is that they had to scale down their operations. Things like research, monitoring of animals, diseases, etc., had to go. Things like community education and awareness had to go, so that they put as much of their finances into wildlife security and human-wildlife conflict, because those are important. Either way, animals will die if nothing is done about it. So that's what Kenya Wildlife Service did, and I know also that other agencies within the region did that, scaling down so that you're concentrating on just keeping animals alive. And also, of course, the people who protect those animals engaged and in, getting a salary. So because of that, of course, you expect that they are opportunistic, people who are opportunistic about it and want to start taking advantage of the fact that there are no resources and poaching. But thankfully, despite the fact that, of course, particularly the poaching of wildlife for the pot has increased, but overall poaching has gone down. For instance, in 2020, there were no rhinos lost, but this is because of refocusing of resources. So it's not as if it just happened. Of course, there was always a risk that they would be poaching, but especially bushmeat. But the fact that funds were put to use to stop poaching and to ensure that wildlife security is enhanced, assisted. IFAW, for instance, in our landscape that we're working in, Amboseli, Savo, Kilimanjaro, some of the funding that we had given to Kenya Wildlife Service for infrastructure development, we reassigned that for wildlife security so as to boost security. We also have rangers, community rangers surrounding in the land that is surrounding Amboseli. 76 rangers, including, and I'm proud to say this, 8 female rangers, the first of their kind. We call them Team Lioness. We ensured that we also boosted their operations in order to ensure that they buffer the national park. So yes, there has been a rise in bushmeat poaching, but if you look at the overall picture, we, because of the efforts that we took, we are not as badly off as we anticipated. Bushmeat poaching, yes, has increased, but it could have been worse if funds were not reassigned. And added to that, the government also came up with a stimulus package. There are a lot of conservancies, as I said before. They consist almost as equal amount of wildlife estate as the traditional protected areas. And these are manned by community rangers. So the government gave this stimulus package to pay for the salaries of the community rangers. who are actually going to go out of a job if that did not happen. So it is commendable that at least the government stepped in. But of course, we are not out of the woods. This has just been a stopgap measure. And indeed, from where I sit, I think that tourism is a very, very important aspect of the conservation of wildlife. I also want to say that we have to appreciate the fact that if communities have put aside that much land for conservation, we need to look for ways and means of supporting them. Constantin?
Thank you very much, James. So I'm seeing more and more questions here on what can I do from home to help support conservation. There's obviously a lot that you can do. A very easy way is to either go to asiliagiving.com or to IFAW.org and donate, because both asiliagiving.org and IFAW.org are well, directly involved in conservation on the ground, and your money will go directly to supporting conservation efforts in East Africa and well, across the continent with Asilia and with IFAW and across the world in some 40 countries. I just wanted to address some of the questions that are coming through here. I'm seeing a lot of medical questions, you know, on whether people should take Malarone when they come to East Africa, when we expect herd immunity and things like that. We sadly don't have any medical professionals on the panel. So I don't think it would be wise of us to give anybody medical advice. I'm not taking Malarone when I come here, but that's a personal choice, and not medical advice. And then I see some questions on travel requirements and entry requirements and things like that. I think those are always best found up to date on the country's government websites or the embassies in your country of residence. So those are probably questions best self-researched with either your doctor or the country's the country of travel's representation in your country of residence. Andrea, I am, because I introduced you as our crystal ball, there are some questions on when do you expect some of the major Western economies like the United States and indeed some of the European countries to lift their travel restrictions. I suppose for recreational travel is the question here, because of course business travel is mostly allowed.
Right. So as obviously right now it's been essential, or if you have family members or you're a national expat, I wish my crystal ball is a little cloudy, and I'm always cautious about saying these things because, as we know, Italy just went back into lockdown. So we make strides and then we take some steps back. But with the US, with our president saying July 4th, he wants everyone vaccinated, I think that's going to open up our borders to incoming international travelers. So I think summer it's hopeful. I think with Greece and Iceland now saying they're accepting people outside of the EU and Americans, I apologize for being American centric, but that's who I am at the moment. I think that is all like a really good beginning steps where it's going to be a trickle, but then I think it's all going to be open. But I think they are wisely being very cautious about it. And I think that the airlines have to figure out as well if we're going to have this in the countries, if we're going to have a vaccine passport. And once they get that solved, then they'll know like how quickly and how open they can be. So I have a feeling they just want to know a little more before they open it up. So I think summer, what I've been hearing is kind of summer and early fall is when to anticipate, but I don't think it will be back as it normally did. And I hope it didn't. We were really suffering from over tourism beforehand. You know, Venice, Barcelona were overwhelmed. And I think that hopefully this is a time that they can figure out a good tourism plan and get their infrastructure ready and then welcome people back. Did that help?
Yeah. Wonderful. I also see a couple of questions here on travel to Tanzania, which is obviously where I am at the moment. So Tanzania is open for travel. Anybody is welcome here. I think the same is true for Kenya. You have to provide a negative COVID test before boarding your flight, but otherwise the countries are open. Questions on reliability of statistics from here, again, I don't think these are questions that we are best placed to answer, because obviously statistics depend on how much testing is being done, and so on and so forth. So those are, again, personal decisions, but I can tell you that having come here from Europe has been smooth, easy, not much of a problem, and I think as George and some others have said, and of course Katie, with the COVID protocols that they have at Asilia, and I saw it in the chat as well, somebody who's recently been to East Africa. I mean, there is a lot of diligence here that I'm anecdotally observing, with people washing their hands. Obviously life happens a lot more outdoors than it does in crowded undergrounds and subway trains and offices as it does in New York and London. Populations are generally younger, it's warmer. So personally, I don't, as long as you exercise sensible common sense and don't enter a crowded bus in Nairobi, I feel fairly safe. There's a great question here for the panel too, which I'll combine because they're two sides of the same coin. The first is that it's obviously people that are a threat to wildlife, and much of that threat is driven by poverty, as we saw bushmeat poaching going up 56% when incomes dried up. What mechanisms can tourism provide to alleviate that issue? And the flip side of that coin is, well, tourism also comes with a negative side of putting pressure on ecosystems, stress on animals, demand for resources. So how can we make tourism a little bit better? And maybe that's something for Katie and George, well, anybody who feels so inclined, jump in.
I think where I am right now in the Nabosho Conservancy, which is north of the main Masai Mara Reserve, is a really great example of both of those things. It's an amazing kind of model that Kenya has really pioneered and taken great strides, and a lot of the rest of Africa and other bits of the world are following, which is wonderful to see, where rather than drawing a line around a piece of land and kicking communities out and saying this is for wildlife only, they say, okay, how do we find a balance? How do we make this work? How can people stay where they're living, which is their right, but they graze cattle a lot around here? How can we manage that and monitor it? And how can we support wildlife and make sure that wildlife has enough space to roam, much like James was saying down in Amboseli? And they do that through all kinds of methods. So there's a lot of discussion between tourism entities creating these conservancies, and then an ongoing discussion to make sure local communities benefit financially from bed night fees, from kind of annual rents. Every tourist who comes pays a bed night fee, and that goes directly to the communities. And then they also have infrastructure like, roads being improved, schools, healthcare systems, sanitation, things like that. So there's benefits in order to control where they graze and move around so that the wildlife can exist. And then also in terms of how tourism can be managed to not overwhelm wildlife and kind of be too much and over tourism, like Andrea was saying in Venice and places. They also have very strict rules here about how many camps, the capacity of the land, the amount of vehicles that you're allowed per camp, the amount of vehicles at any sighting, very kind of well managed rules, and everybody plays by those rules because they all understand the greater good and the importance for the experience for travelers, for the wildlife, to not interrupt and disrupt them. So it's an amazing place to be, and the wildlife sightings are fantastic, and I think it's just an incredible model. It's really inspiring.
Yeah, and if I can, just to echo Katie's thoughts as well, Nabosho is actually my favorite place in the whole of the world, so I'm slightly biased. But having taken my mum there for her 50th birthday a couple of years ago for her first ever wildlife viewing experience, it is no doubt for a tourist the best experience for the reasons that Katie's just described. I think there's no more than 4 or 5 cars at any singular viewing. And if you've been to some of the busier parts of, for example, the bordering Masai Mara National Reserve, sometimes you can get upwards of 10, 15, 20 cars looking at one single animal. And you might ask yourself the same question that one of the attendees asked is, what is the impact on the animal? In the Boy Show, those type of questions never arise. And it's an amazing place as well, because when you speak with the guides at Asilia, they can tell you all about how the business model of the Boy Show works. There's hundreds of landowners who are involved, and you really do feel like as the tourist that you are having a direct impact on conservation by empowering the local community. And in the Boy Show itself, which I touched on earlier, there's so many amazing conservation projects that Asilia and all the other operators are involved with. So with Asilia, for example, you have the opportunity to get involved with so many of those projects. So it feels like you're getting a real hands-on experience as well. And just quickly, if you don't mind, Constantin, you had a great question earlier about how people can do more for conservation from home. I did touch on it earlier, and I saw there was another question as well about asking to elaborate a bit more with regards to photography conservation. Yeah. So it was actually from Marion, who, along with someone called P, set up an amazing initiative called Prints for Wildlife. I think that was maybe last June or July. And between the two of them, they rallied up a real plethora of wildlife photographers from across the world and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for conservation. I think this is for African parks, actually. That's a great example, but I do appreciate that not everybody is a professional wildlife photographer. And like anything, at the base of it, it starts with advocacy. So as you were saying, the easiest thing you can do is go on to Asilia Giving or the IFAW website and donate. But the next best thing you can do is tell your friends and all of your family. And what a lot of us have been doing over the last year is sitting behind our laptops, our desktops, and our phones. And I think I can probably speak for a lot of us. We're all have probably been overusing social media in the last year. And there's a lot of negative things on social media, but it is probably the most powerful tool now for spreading messages very, very quick, positive messages very, very quickly. And I myself, as a diligent follower of IFAW's social media and Asilia's social media, what they've been sharing over the last year enables you to share that too to your friends and family if you feel like you're unable to donate. And with regards to photographers as well, I would think about it in 2 separate ways. So for example, if you're just going on your first ever safari, or if it's your 10th ever safari, your images they're money. They provide value to somebody. So whether, for example, that's donating your photos to IFAW so they can better highlight and showcase one of their projects, or perhaps a smaller community initiative in the Boy Show that myself and Katie have mentioned, that's a great place to start. Again, social media, that's fairly obvious as well, telling the stories around the people, the landscapes, the communities, the wildlife, all the different projects is also a great place to start. And if you're fortunate enough to make a living, small, medium, or large from selling your photos, maybe think about selling or donating a small percentage of your revenue. And I say revenue because I think profit's a bit cheeky sometimes. So I suggest that people donate maybe 10, 15, 20% of their revenue to one of their favorite charities is also a great thing to do. But like I said, I think advocacy is the main thing. And given the fact we live in such a digital age and we're all now sitting on Zoom from multiple different continents and talking with people all over the world is a great way of highlighting that. You too have the power to do that through your own means, whether you have 5 friends on Facebook or 500 friends on Facebook. That's a great place to start as well.
Thank you so much. That's a great point. Oh, go on, Andrea.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I know time is running out. One for a good conservation model would be Antarctica and also Galapagos. I don't know if Africa has ever looked at some of those models, but my last trip before the lockdown was Antarctica, and I know they restrict how many people are permitted on land at the same time. They restrict the number of ships, and I think they're doing as hard as it is because so many people want to go to Antarctica. They're really, I think, making the wildlife and the environment the priority. Galapagos also is another model where some islands, they will have them not permit anybody on so they can kind of recover and restore. And so I think that's kind of a nice area of conservation, but it is getting overrun. Second point thank you, IFAW. I did a piece about symbolic adoptions, and it's really some of these organizations. There's one in South Africa, and you can actually pick your penguin and sponsor a penguin. You can name the penguin, or you can pick an egg. And then if you can when you finally get to South Africa, you can meet your little adopted penguin. So I have a piece that I ran, and I was so grateful for the organization to provide some partners that they worked with, or some nonprofits that are pouring a lot of money into conservation. So those are my 2 points.
Thank you so much. I also saw another question that I thought is interesting that also ties Asilia and IFAW together, which is female empowerment. And obviously we're just 10 days after World Women's Day. We have at IFAW, we have an all-female ranger unit operating in Kenya called Team Lioness. And Asilia has a fantastic camp that is all female run, which I believe makes it the only one in Africa. And that's a fabulous place. So can maybe both of you talk to us a little bit about the role of women in East African societies, the empowerment and the phenomenal work that they're doing, both as part of Team Lioness and as part of your camp.
I was going to offer that to James, but it looks like he's having some technical issues.
Why don't you start, Katie?
I'll start, but I'll be brief because I know I've been talking a lot. So Dunia is our camp in the central Serengeti that you were mentioning, which is staffed entirely by women. It was a first in Africa to do that, and a real change to the norm culturally here in East Africa, where for women to do a job, even being a cook or housekeeping in a safari camp was an extraordinary idea at the time. And we were fortunate to have a few really bright individuals who'd come through Asilia's training program and really kind of championed this cause, and the management really wanted to try and create an environment where it was possible to do some of these jobs. And the idea was floated, why don't we have an all-female camp, and then we can show the world that it's possible. And these women are absolute superheroes, and they are the first in their families, in their villages, in their age groups, certainly in their regions and things, who are doing any of these jobs. But as role models, it's incredible. And we saw a lot of skepticism to begin with from other guides coming into camp and thinking, well, they're not going to know what to do and they can't manage a camp, etc. And we've proved them wrong. And really the experience is spectacular, and they're just amazing role models.
James, a few words on Team Lioness? James, can you hear me? No, you might have connectivity issues. Well, I suppose I can perhaps say half a sentence on it. Team Lioness is an all-female ranger unit that operates in Amboseli National Park in southern Kenya, very close to Kilimanjaro. We've been very lucky that it's been covered widely in the news, so you can find wonderful articles in global media if you Google Team Lioness and IFAW's Team Lioness. You'll find information. What the rangers themselves say in some of the interviews that we've done with them is that actually as women they have a significant advantage in getting information on poaching, because the men don't really expect them to be rangers, sometimes working undercover. There's a trust level between the women, so they actually often find that they can be more effective in some aspects of their jobs, actually, especially because they are women. It also has given them an enormous sense of purpose and pride, and standing within their families and their communities. So it's really been a phenomenally exciting journey to see that Ranger unit sort of, well, I guess, come into full force and operate very effectively. So so that's a very cool thing. And if you want to see more, if you just Google IFAW's Team Lioness, you'll find lots of information. I've seen some questions here on whether COVID restrictions limit safari experiences, whether that's changed much. I guess George and I can probably say from personal experience that Asilia is so private and exclusive at the best of times that you'll never encounter anything crowded there, whether restrictions or not. And it's probably the nicest, most sustainable way of experiencing safari. But generally, I mean, certainly at present, East Africa is empty. 98% drop in arrivals. Social distancing is essentially a given because you're going to be by yourself. And you know, I was in Ngorongoro crater last August, and there were fewer cars there on the day that I was there than the day records started. And as George has said, you know, at the crossings at the Mara River for the Great Migration, in 5 days there, I think I saw a total of 5 cars. So it's, you know, it's fabulous for the individual. It's a disaster for tourism, wildlife conservation, and the local communities. I think we've lost James, sadly, to bush connectivity, because there was another question here that would have been for him. But there's an interesting question here, George. You'll probably you're a keen scholar of animals. You'll probably have a good answer for this. Do you reckon that the effect of the absence of tourists is going to have a lasting effect on the animals' behavior? Because obviously they're used to being observed and viewed now for a year and a half. Well, by the time people come back, it might be 2 years. They will not have had as much exposure to humans. Will that change anything when the tourists do come back?
Well, obviously I can only speak anecdotally because I'm not a qualified scientist. But what I can talk from is from experience last year, after 2 months in the bush, I mean, half of which was actually in northern Serengeti and eastern Serengeti, which are 2 pretty quiet areas anyway during the time of the year that I was there. From what I saw, no. And from speaking with the guides, who obviously are the experts, the answer is no as well. Tends to be, although there's, I mean, very, very few tourists around. For example, in Kenya, KWS is still going around. Rangers in the Serengeti are still going around. And I don't think a lion really forgets either. Obviously, elephants don't forget, but lions certainly don't seem to forget either. Interestingly, there was one particular encounter with a male lion who did seem particularly skittish, but there was also reasons for that, in that he was in the pride area of 3 big dominant males, which is probably why he was a lot more skittish. And from what I've heard of friends who have been to East Africa and around Africa now in the last few months and last summer, it doesn't seem to have affected anything. I think the only thing it might affect are the cubs, for example, of the lions I was just mentioning, because obviously they will be growing up with very little exposure. But like anything, just like us humans, everything's learned from their parents. So it's quite likely that it's not going to be a huge change. But I suppose that remains to be seen until greater numbers of people start returning to the respective parks. Yeah.
And you know, it's I see a question here also on sort of over tourism and pressures from tourism. I be curious on your views on this, but anecdotally, I think my answer and thoughts on this is there are so many national parks in Africa, but also in Tanzania and Kenya, and actually one of the big challenges for wildlife conservation as a whole is that people sort of do the bucket list trips, which is the same reason that causes troubles for Venice and Paris, as Andrea was referencing earlier. When people come here, they want to go to the Masai Mara, or they want to go to the Serengeti, they want to go to Kilimanjaro. They forget that there are parks like Katavi, like Gombe, like Mkomazi here in Tanzania, which get hardly any tourists at all, which actually makes for better safari in many cases, because during normal times it's not crowded. So I think it's my view would be, it's not about having less tourists coming to Tanzania, Kenya, or any of the other countries, but it would be tour operators and indeed the tourists themselves choosing to go to lesser known parks to sort of to spread out the tourists. What are your thoughts on that to this question?
Completely. And if I said earlier, my favorite place in Kenya is Naboisho, but actually where you are now in Tanzania, it's Ruaha. And I've been to Ruaha with Asilia a couple of years ago, and as a safari experience, it's unbelievable. Obviously during those times, we're fortunate enough not to be living during a pandemic. And even then, it's very easy to have leopard sightings, for example. Leopards up a beautiful baobab with not a single tourist in sight. And it's exactly like you're saying, it's just fanning tourists out across the other respective parks. Salu's another really good example as well in Tanzania. Fairly unknown, or at least it could be known, but a lot of people don't make their way down there. If you like birds, it's just the most amazing experience. And just like you're saying, Constantine, I completely agree. It's just spreading that tourism out. I mean, as James was talking around earlier, now more than ever, when it's safe to do so, travel and tourism is needed so badly in East Africa and across the world, actually. So my advice would be, if you're worried about over-tourism, or at least you don't want to be contributing to that, because certainly there are instances of that in central Serengeti, find somewhere a bit off the map. I mean, Asilia, using Asilia as an example, Salu, Ruaha, two amazing national parks if you're wanting to taste a little bit something different in Tanzania. And of course you can tack on your Serengeti experience, but just mix it up a bit more, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And well, Asilia has camps in a lot of those places. I see we're already sort of running over time, but I see that our attendee numbers haven't dropped. So we'll sort of start to wrap it up. Andrea, you're the journalist. You have a large audience.
Yeah.
Can we put a little bit of an onus on you to write about the lesser known parks and to help us drive people into some of those areas, so that because at the end of the day, nature will only be saved if it makes money for the local communities, and it doesn't get turned into farmland. So can you help us drive some tourists there? Can you start writing?
And I absolutely agree with that. And that's even what I was saying in the States, that we don't always have to go to like the big national parks. Like there's some people have been discovering their state park or their local park and the joys of that. And also in terms of Africa too, even the animals, the big five are amazing, but one of my favorite countries is Madagascar. And I love lemurs, but the bugs and the chameleons are amazing. So we just have to look on leaves now and just pay closer attention to just nature and not get chasing these big five that are all great. But the giraffe weasel is such a great little bug. It has a little giraffe neck and everything. So I agree with you. We need to emphasize that there's more out there. It's a giant world. We can spread out and we will all have an incredible experience.
Yeah, and I saw, questions on, I suppose, more conservation active tourism of collaring and going out with, rangers and so on. Those things you will never be able to witness and participate in the Serengeti or in the sort of the big parks. If you want to do stuff like that, you've got to go to the lesser known parks and build relationships and things like that, because there you can do it. I know of a park in Zambia in the North Luangwa, where you can actually go out and assist the scientists in collaring and so on. So for all of these things, I'd recommend just write to Asilia, write to us at IFAW, and we're happy to point you in the right direction. Write to people like George, because obviously he gets taken around by the right people to take his photographs. Last thoughts from anybody? Future of travel, what can people do? What are your final thoughts? Should we just go around? Katie, do you want to start?
Sure. I think for me and for Asilia, this whole crisis has kind of really reinforced our sense of purpose and what's important. We've had to forget about all of the noise and really focus on the key things, and that helps drive me when we're having a tough day or a tough week. But I also think travelers have been through a lot, and they've been through a tough time. They've been away from being able to travel, so I think they will travel more consciously. They want something, not just an average trip. They want something interesting and rewarding, but also sustainable, and that gives me a lot of hope, because that's the world that we all operate in, and we know what good it can do. So
thank you. George.
Just to echo Katie's thoughts again, wise old Katie, that I think the focus will be a lot more around tourists wanting a more sustainable experience that's very conservation focused. And like you were saying, Constantine, there are places already that exist like that. I mean, a great example, again, to use Asilia's Old Pejeta. There are so many things you can do with regards to conservation activities. I'm really excited to see where it's going to be heading. Obviously, I'm very sad and dismayed that we have been and are currently in this situation, but I'm very confident that as we come out the back of this pandemic, that the future of travel looks a lot brighter, and companies like Asilia are very well placed to support where I believe the new trend is going.
Andrea.
Yes, I see this as the reset button, and this is a time where the travel industry, countries, and travelers themselves can proceed and do it right, to just stay on this course of, as you said, being a thoughtful traveler, being a slow traveler, and being an appreciative traveler. And again, I cannot emphasize enough that there needs to be this return to civility and tolerance, and just, we're all in this together. It happened this year, and we're going to get through this together, and we have to maintain that sense of unity.
Thank you so much. James, do we have you back for a final thought? We do not. All right. I suppose that concludes today's session. Thank you, everybody, for staying a little bit longer. I can see that we still have most of our people. Just as a final note, we will send a recording of this session around to all participants, and we will include all the links and more information on the things that we've discussed. And there is obviously also a very special treat, a discount for Asilia accommodation, which are hard to get. So look into your inbox for that, for whenever you feel ready to come and travel again, which I can only recommend to do as early as possible. And to answer one last question in my final remarks, book directly. Go to asiliaafrica.com and just book straight there, because that means that more of your money is going to arrive directly on the ground in the project. If you do want to support asiliagiving.org, IFAW.org, you can support us all there, and you can find out more about the conservation projects if you want to include those in your travels. And yeah, other than that, thank you all very, very much for joining us. You'll get a follow-up email with everything. Thank you to Katie, to George, to Andrea, to James, and obviously to the teams behind the scenes at IFAW and Asilia for putting all of this together, and the fabulous technology that held up from the United States to Pakistan and the bush here in Africa where we are. And please join us again when Asilia Africa and IFAW invite you for the next webinar. Thank you very much, and goodbye.